Segment Sheva Nikud Arba Nikud Beit. Ya'an asher chata'u ve'asu et hama'aseh hara hazeh. Ya'an asher chata'u ve'asu et hama'aseh hara hazeh. In this segment, you'll learn how to describe past events that were loosely connected, not dependent on each other, not sequential. In the title quotation, focus on the verb ve'asu. We want to note that there are two possible options for translating ve'asu. On the one hand, it may be a vav conversive v'katal, in which case it should be rendered, then they will or would do something, or then they will or would commit some act. Notice in particular the future or potential orientation of the translation. In addition, notice the sense of consecution in the translation, then they will, and so forth. That's vav conversive v'katal. There is, however, a second option. As was briefly noted in an earlier segment, not each verb that is spelled with a vav followed by a katal is a vav conversive v'katal. It's possible to encounter a verb consisting of a vav followed by a katal in which the meaning is simply like a katal, that is, it is past tense. And the vav is a simple conjunction, not indicating sequential action following on whatever had preceded. We title these vav copulative v'katal forms, in contrast to vav conversive. Copulative suggesting they simply exist, as opposed to conversive, where there is a conversion of the tense meaning from katal past to a virtual yiktol future. In the case of the verb in question, ve'asu, then exercising the second option as a vav copulative v'katal, the meaning would simply be, and they did or committed some act. Notice past tense, and they did, not they will. Notice the lack of sequential orientation. We're not saying, and then something happened, simply, it did happen. How can we know whether a given v'katal form is of the sort that will shift its tense and be sequential, that is, vav conversive, or what we might conceive of as the simpler form, a vav copulative, that simply remains in the katal, the past tense, wherein the conjunction is simply and, not and then? Two clues. First, context, that is, experiment with the two alternatives and see which makes sense given surrounding material. Second, and this second will apply only to two finite forms, two parts of the conjugation. First, first common singular, and next, second masculine singular. As you may recall from earlier material, in those instances, when it's vav copulative, this simpler form that we are now learning, then the accent will fall where we would normally expect it, such as in the form v'shamarti. It reminds us of the call form, shamarti, accent on the next to the last syllable known as the penultimate. In contrast with that form, if the accent rests on the last syllable, v'shamarti, then we know we're working with a vav conversive. Similar with the second masculine singular. If the accent has moved to the last syllable, v'shamarta, then we know it's vav conversive. Unfortunately for us, this only obtains in two parts of the conjugation. For the rest of them, we're entirely dependent on the first clue, which is context, to determine whether a given form is vav conversive or vav copulative. Let's take this information and see how it will help us choose the right meaning for the title excerpt, which heads this segment, namely, Ya'an asher chata'u ve'asu et hama'aseh hara hazeh. First option would be to recognize our target verb, ve'asu, as a vav conversive v'katal, throwing it into the future with a sequential sense. This would yield the translation in context, because they sinned, and then will commit this evil deed, In context, however, this option does not fit, because the evil deed, namely the robbery, doesn't belong to the realm of the future. This is an offense which has already been committed, for which the priest is seeking redress. The other option would be to recognize v'asu as a vav copulative v'katal, one which remains in the past tense. This would result in the translation, because they sinned and committed this evil deed. Now, this translation fits the story, because the robbery is an event that has been committed. As to the second clue, that is, looking for a displaced accent, this clue will not offer assistance in this instance because the target form, v'asu, does not happen to be one of those two conjugations which betray a change in accent based on whether they are vav conversive or vav copulative. So again, the second clue won't help us here. We're dependent entirely on context for selecting the better meaning. To round out this segment, we'll be walking through two excerpts from the Hebrew Bible, one of which has several instances of the vav conversive v'katal, the other of which has v'katal operating as a vav copulative. The example on the right presents Pharaoh speaking to his advisors, explaining his cruel policy of population subjugation. Pen yirbe v'haya ki tikrena milchama v'nosaf gam hu al sona'enu v'nilcham banu ve'ala min haaretz. Notice that the verbs v'nosaf, it would join, referring to the people of Israel, and v'nilcham, it would fight, and ve'ala, it would go up, together form a sequential series. One event is anticipated as happening after the next, and they are all cast in the future. Even v'haya is a vav conversive, cast in the future. Now the example from 1 Kings 3. In this situation, Solomon has recently become king. He has presented a petition to God asking for insight, when at the same time he had the option of asking for a long life. God now addresses the king, commending him for his choice. Ya'an asher sha'alta et hadavar hazeh, velo sha'alta lecha yamim rabim, v'sha'alta lecha havin. Notice that the v'katal verb v'sha'alta, but you have requested, stands in coordinating, not in a sequential relationship to the preceding action, which is sha'alta in line 1. Thus the v'katal, v'sha'alta in the last line, joins with the first, standing alongside it as a contrastive whole. You have not chosen A, but you have chosen B. These are not sequential, but standing parallel, contrastive. A past tense fits this context, since it describes some of King Solomon's behavior which has recently occurred. Further, the second masculine singular accent that we find in v'sha'alta appears where we would expect it if it were simply a katal form, that is, on the next to the last syllable, the penultimate. For these reasons, v'sha'alta is a vav copulative v'katal, not changing tense to the future and not sequential. If instead it were written v'sha'alta, we would recognize by this shift in accent to the ultima syllable that it would have been a vav conversive.